The last time anyone saw Sister Helena, she was stepping out of the chapel after evening mass, the faint sound of hymns still echoing through the stained glass. It was 1985, and the convent nestled in the hills of northern Vermont was quiet, peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But that peace shattered the moment she vanished. No scream, no struggle, just silence. One minute she was there, the next gone. Her room untouched, her Bible open on her desk, her rosary still on the pillow. For years, her disappearance haunted the convent, a mystery that sank its roots deep into the hearts of every nun who remained behind. Authorities searched tirelessly. Forests were combed, wells were emptied, villagers whispered of secret tunnels and forgotten sins. But no evidence was ever found. Eventually, time did what it always does. It buried the questions beneath layers of routine and resignation. New sisters came, the old ones left, and slowly, the mystery of Sister Helena became a ghost story, the kind told in hushed tones during winter storms, when the wind howled through the stained glass like a voice trying to return. Then, 27 years later, during renovations on the east wing of the convent, a discovery turned quiet memory into fresh terror. Behind a crumbling wall, sealed away with bricks older than anyone remembered laying, workers found something horrifyingly familiar. A nun's habit, perfectly preserved, folded with care, as though placed there, not hidden in haste, but deliberately, with purpose, with ritual. The moment the cloth touched air, everything changed. A room that had felt still and stale was suddenly heavy, charged, as though a presence long dormant had just woken up. One of the workers claimed he heard someone whispering his name. Another refused to return the next day, pale and shaking, mumbling about a pair of eyes watching from the shadows, eyes that weren't human. And in the heart of it all, Sister Helena's name returned to every mouth like a spell that had finally been spoken again. But this was not a case of simply uncovering the past. It was something far more dangerous, something deeper, because the habit wasn't just a clue, it was a key. And once it was removed from that wall, the door was meant to keep shut began to open, slowly, silently. And the question that now haunted everyone who stepped foot in that convent wasn't what happened to Sister Helena, but why someone went to such great lengths to make sure she would never be found. The morning after the habit was discovered, the convent fell into a silence deeper than usual. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of dread. The air seemed colder, though no windows were open. The halls that once echoed with prayer now swallowed sound like a sponge. Sister Agnes, one of the oldest nuns still living in the convent, was the first to recognize the garment. Her face turned ashen the moment she touched it. "This was Helena's," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I would know the stitching anywhere." When asked how she could be sure after 27 years, she didn't hesitate. "I made it for her myself," she said. Every thread, every fold, it was hers. The habit wasn't torn, nor damaged. No signs of struggle. Only time had touched it. It had been preserved like a relic. But if Sister Helena had vanished without a trace, how had her clothing ended up sealed inside a wall that hadn't been touched in decades? Curiosity soon gave way to unease. That night, Sister Agnes said she dreamed of Helena standing at the foot of her bed, her face hidden beneath her veil. In the dream, she didn't speak, only pointed toward the chapel door. When Sister Agnes woke, her sheets were soaked with sweat, and the chapel door, which she was sure had been locked, stood slightly ajar. No one else admitted to opening it. The younger nuns grew anxious. Strange things began happening around the convent. Candles extinguished themselves. Statues shifted slightly when no one was looking. One sister claimed to hear soft weeping in the confessional, though the door had been locked for years. Another heard her name whispered in the hallway, not once, but over and over, like a lullaby. Each time she turned, no one was there. Despite the growing fear, the Mother Superior refused to involve the church authorities. She insisted it was simply the stress of renovations and the resurfacing of old trauma. But even she couldn't ignore the fact that every time they attempted to seal the wall back up, the mortar would crack overnight. Every single night, as if something inside refused to be buried again. Sister Lucia, one of the novices who had only recently taken her vows, became particularly affected. She began waking at exactly 3:17 every morning, the same time the bells had told the night Sister Helena disappeared. At first, she thought it was coincidence. But when it happened 7 nights in a row, always accompanied by the sound of soft footsteps outside her door, she started keeping a diary, each entry more frantic than the last. On the 8th night, she left her room with a candle and followed the sound. Down the hall, past the silent dormitories, into the eastern wing, the part that had been closed off for repairs. As she reached the end of the corridor, she saw it. A faint light, a sliver of flickering candle glow beneath the sealed chapel door. Her heart pounded as she approached. No one was allowed in there after dusk. No candles had been lit. She hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. The room was empty, dark, cold. But on the altar, something had changed. A single object sat neatly in the center, a wooden rosary, its beads cracked and worn. Sister Lucia's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it. It had hung for years on the edge of the painting in the hallway, right where Sister Helena's portrait used to be, before it was removed and never seen again. The next morning, she reported what she had seen. But the rosary was gone. The other nuns checked the chapel. Nothing. No signs of disturbance. No candle wax. No objects on the altar. Mother Superior scolded her for making up stories. But Sister Lucia knew what she had seen. And later that day, she made a chilling discovery in one of the old prayer journals stored in the convent archives. An entry, dated one day before Sister Helena vanished. It read, "She told me not to trust the light behind the wall. She said it sings. And once you hear it, it knows your name." That night, Sister Lucia didn't sleep. She stared at the wall where the habit had been found. Every crack, every line, every uneven brick. It was no longer just a wall. It was a threshold, and whatever lay beyond it wasn't done with him yet. The following morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the convent gates. Father Miguel, a retired priest who had once served in the region decades earlier. No one had summoned him, and yet he claimed he had felt called to return. His eyes, dark and tired, wandered the convent grounds as if searching for something that only he could feel. When he was told of the habit found behind the wall, he grew pale and silent. Later, behind closed doors, he confessed to the Mother Superior that Sister Helena had come to him once, not in confession, but in fear. She had spoken of hearing voices from inside the walls. Not evil, not screaming, singing, gentle, melodic, inviting. She said the hymn had no words, but it spoke to her all the same. It promised peace, belonging, and she had begun to hum it, even in her sleep. Father Miguel begged her not to go near it again, but she had grown distant. Her journal entries became erratic, filled with strange symbols and Latin phrases that made little sense. And then, just days later, she disappeared. The investigation at the time had been thorough, but no one ever thought to check the eastern wall. It was too old, too solid, too forgotten. Until now. What disturbed Father Miguel the most wasn't the habit. It was the fact that Sister Helena's rosary had reappeared. He remembered it well. She had stopped wearing it in the days before her disappearance, claimed it interfered with the song. That had drowned it out. The rosary was her silence, and she had grown tired of being silent. He stared at the altar with haunted eyes and whispered, "If the rosary is back, it means the song is looking for a new voice." That night, the convent's bells rang at 3:17 again. Only this time, they rang without being touched. No wind, no power surge. The bells rang 3 times, then stopped. And when the sisters gathered in panic, they found the east hallway soaked, not with rainwater, but with holy water from the chapel fonts. The crucifix that had hung on the wall had fallen, snapped in two. No one spoke, but all of them knew something had been disturbed, and it was growing stronger. Sister Lucia couldn't shake the feeling that her name was no longer her own. It echoed in her ears in moments of stillness, whispered from behind doors that hadn't been opened in years. The others began to notice it too. Their dreams turned violent. Some saw fire, others darkness. But Sister Lucia saw a face. Helena's face, aged, decayed, weeping behind a veil that moved like smoke. In a moment of desperation, Lucia returned to the archives. She searched every document tied to the original construction of the convent. Buried in a stack of brittle, yellowed blueprints, She found a page labeled in Latin, Domus Vocis, House of the Voice. It showed a chamber hidden behind the eastern wall, a room not listed anywhere else, built before the chapel itself, before the land was consecrated. A room designed without doors. According to a marginal note, it had once served a different purpose. A place for silence. A place to trap the voice that had once sung men to madness. It was sealed with prayer, bricks, and blessed ash, until, as one line ominously put it, the song forgets it is bound. That phrase chilled her, because now the song wasn't bound. It was echoing, and it had found ears once again. Lucia brought the plans to Father Miguel, who stared at them in horror. He recognized the design. It wasn't a convent chamber. It was a chamber of containment, a crypt, not for the dead, but for something alive. Something that should never have been built under sacred ground. She didn't vanish, he said. She entered willingly. She opened what had been sealed, and it took her. They both knew what had to be done. The wall could no longer remain intact. Not if the song was seeping through it again. But when they brought the plans to the Mother Superior and requested permission to excavate, she refused. She said no one would destroy part of a holy structure on the basis of ghost stories and forgotten blueprints. Her final words before walking away were quiet, but final. If Helena chose to walk into darkness, it is not our place to pull her back. Father Miguel didn't sleep that night. He wandered the chapel long after the others had gone to their rooms, pausing before each stained glass window, as if listening to the silence between the colors. Around 3 a.m, he knelt at the altar, whispering prayers not found in any book, the kind of words old priests carried with them, passed down in fear, not in faith. As he prayed, a wind stirred in the chapel despite the sealed windows, and one candle blew out by itself. At that moment, he felt a presence behind him, not threatening, but heavy. As he turned, he saw her. Not fully, just the impression of a figure standing beneath the arch of the sanctuary. A dark veil, a pale hand, and the glint of rosary beads swaying gently in the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any sound escaped, she was gone. No footstep, no door creak, only the smell of lilies and smoke. The next morning, Sister Lucia found him sitting outside the chapel, clutching the blueprints to his chest like scripture. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips trembling. He finally confessed what he had seen and what he believed. Sister Helena hadn't just followed the voice. She had become part of it. She is not just trapped, he said. She is the song now. A vessel, a mouth, a prayer that never ends. They knew the Mother Superior would never approve demolition. So that evening, under cover of darkness, Lucia and Father Miguel returned to the eastern wing with tools, a chisel, a hammer, holy water, and a single candle. They began to work in silence, brick by brick, tearing away the decades-old wall with trembling hands. The further they dug, the colder the air became. Not the kind of cold felt on skin, but in the soul, a cold that whispered. And then, the sound began. Faint, distant, a single, sustained note, not from an instrument, but a voice. High, pure, impossibly clear. It didn't frighten him at first. It sounded like someone singing in a cathedral far away. But as the wall crumbled and the opening widened, the voice grew louder, closer. And that's when Father Miguel dropped the hammer and whispered, "She's not singing to us, she's listening." The final brick gave way with a soft crack, revealing a narrow space beyond. Darkness spilled out like ink, heavier than shadow, pressing into the corridor like a living thing. Neither Lucia nor Father Miguel moved for a moment. The singing had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that pulsed with anticipation. It wasn't just a room behind the wall. It was a void, a cavity carved not into stone, but into reality itself. With the candle held high, they stepped inside. The walls were lined with ancient scripture, scorched into the stone in a language neither of them recognized. Symbols swirled and twisted in patterns that seemed to shift when not directly observed. At the center of the room sat a stone chair, not a throne, not an altar, just a seat, and resting on it a veil, black, folded neatly, waiting. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. She knew it even before she touched it. It was Helena's. But as her fingers grazed the fabric, a jolt surged through her chest. A sensation not of touch, but of memory. She saw images, rapid, disjointed. Helena kneeling, chanting, bleeding from her ears, smiling through the pain, reaching toward a shape in the dark and whispering, "I will sing for you." Father Miguel cried out, stumbling backward as the air thickened, pressing into them like water in a deep sea. The candle flickered violently, then died. In the pitch-black silence, the voice returned. Not distant, not faint. This time it was directly behind them. Not a melody, a whisper. "You came too late." And with that, the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Once, before the door behind them slammed shut. Panic surged. Lucia screamed, pounding on the stone, but the entrance had vanished. Father Miguel whispered prayers in a language older than Latin, his voice shaking, but the darkness swallowed the sound. Then, from the seat behind them, the veil began to rise on its own, slowly, elegantly, as if lifted by invisible hands. And beneath it, the outline of a face began to form, one they knew but no longer recognized. The shape beneath the veil was still at first, almost serene. Then it tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, in a way that bones should not allow. The candle had long since gone out, yet the outline of the figure remained visible, illuminated not by light, but by presence. An awareness, a consciousness, the kind that did not blink, the kind that did not forget. Lucia could not move. Her body refused. Her voice caught somewhere between breath and scream. The veil continued to rise, folding gently through the air, revealing a face that was not a face. It was Sister Helena, and yet it wasn't. Her features were too smooth, her eyes too wide, black as polished stone, reflecting nothing. Her lips didn't part, but a sound came from her, a note, low and steady, that vibrated inside the walls themselves. Father Miguel dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The sound wasn't loud, but it pierced thought like a needle through silk. Lucia tried to back away, but the room stretched as she moved, lengthening like a corridor in a nightmare. The veil drifted downward again, wrapping around the rising figure like a shroud, as if shielding it from the weight of being seen. The note continued, growing richer, layered, not in harmony, but in distortion. Other voices joined, faint at first, then stronger, feminine, masculine, ancient, familiar, all coming from her, and not from her. Father Miguel gasped. "She's not alone," he whispered. "She's full." His words collapsed into sobs. So many voices all inside, all singing through her. The realization was worse than possession. It was absorption. Sister Helena had not simply joined the song. She had become its choir, its cathedral, its instrument. And now, she stood as a gate, not between worlds, but between sound and silence. And then the figure took a step forward. One single step, but it sounded like thunder. The room pulsed in response, the stone vibrating with each heartbeat. The singing stopped, all of it. In the hollow silence that followed, Sister Helena, or the thing that wore her memory, raised a hand and pointed at Lucia. Not in welcome, not in warning, but in selection. A gesture as ancient as time. One must carry it forward. Lucia trembled, her back against a far wall, hands pressed to the cold stone behind her. Her mind raced to reject what her eyes refused to deny. The thing that had once been Sister Helena stood poised, calm, and absolute. There was no rage, no malice, only inevitability, the quiet terror of something ancient and patient, something that had waited nearly 3 decades, and now saw its moment. The voice returned, not aloud, but inside Lucia's head. It was soft, childlike. It carried no accent, no tone, and yet it whispered in the exact rhythm of her own breathing. "It needs a singer. It needs a heart." She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her temples, but the voice only grew clearer. "You opened the wall. You followed the sound. You saw the veil. You were always the next." Father Miguel tried to stand, to reach her, but he collapsed again with a strangled cry. Blood trickled from his nose. His fingers twitched, as though trying to trace the shape of a forgotten prayer in the air. He looked at her through watery eyes and gasped, "Don't listen, don't let it write itself into you." But Lucia already knew. The song didn't ask for permission. It only asked for space. The chamber began to close. Not physically, but perceptually. The air thickened, the edges of the room curled inward, and the center became clearer, sharper. The figure held out its hands, and in its palms lay a single object, a rosary. Not worn, not broken, new. The beads shimmered as though carved from obsidian and bone. Its cross was inverted, not in mockery, but in inversion of purpose. It was not a symbol of salvation. It was a tether. Lucia stepped forward, not out of desire, not out of control, but out of compulsion, so deep it felt written into her blood. The voice inside her head faded, replaced by a rhythm, a pulse. Her own heartbeat, now no longer hers alone. She extended her hand, inches from the rosary, and in that breathless moment, the chamber listened, as though the very stones waited to hear what note she would play. Her fingers hovered above the rosary, trembling, inches away from the thing that pulsed with unnatural life. The beads seemed to move ever so slightly, like they were breathing or waiting. A deep vibration filled the space, not heard but felt, echoing through Lucia's bones like the low hum of a great organ pressing its first note. She wasn't simply being offered a relic. She was being summoned. Then, something shifted. A voice, not inside her head this time, but external, real, weak. It was Father Miguel. "Lucia," he groaned. "Break it, don't take it. Please. You have a choice." His hand reached forward, shaking, fingers clawing at the floor, as if every inch closer to her might undo what was unfolding. His eyes were wide with knowing, not fear of death, but fear of what survives after the wrong decision. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers froze. The chamber darkened, the presence reacting to hesitation. The figure in front of her, the thing wearing Sister Helena's face, tilted its head slowly, then lowered the rosary, not in defeat, not in warning, but in invitation. And behind it, the darkness opened wider. She saw flashes, not of hell, not of fire, but of others. Other sisters, other voices, faces pressed against invisible walls, mouths open mid-song, eyes pleading in silent agony. Suddenly, the walls began to pulse. Symbols etched in forgotten languages bled crimson light, dripping down the stone like tears. The pressure inside the chamber built with every heartbeat. Father Miguel screamed now, louder than before. "If you take it, you won't be you anymore." But even as he spoke, the floor cracked beneath him. The chamber wanted her. The song needed her. And it wasn't asking anymore. It was claiming. Lucia closed her eyes. Her hand fell to her side. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened. The music stopped. Not faded, stopped. A silence, so complete it felt like the end of breath. The chamber recoiled. The symbols dimmed. The rosary in the figure's hand turned to ash. Helena's form flickered, glitched. For a moment, just one, the veil dropped, and what stood behind it wasn't human, or even pretending to be. It was ancient, faceless, and now it was angry. The entire room convulsed. The walls groaned with a sound like cracking bones. The floor beneath them buckled, sending debris and dust into the air. Father Miguel shouted for Lucia, but she couldn't move. Her body had gone cold, frozen by the sheer force of what had been revealed. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a memory made sentient, a song that had learned to possess silence. The chamber's darkness reached outward now, snatching at her limbs like tendrils of oil and smoke. But something resisted. A light, faint, flickering, emanated from the blueprint still clutched in Father Miguel's hand. The ink glowed, as if the sacred geometry etched into the paper had awakened. He raised it in desperation, and the shadows recoiled like a tide pulled back by the moon. Lucia saw her chance. She crawled to him through the chaos, her breath ragged, fingers scraped raw by the floor. He pressed the glowing paper in her hands and whispered a single word: seal. Not destroy, not fight. Seal. The chamber couldn't be defeated, but could be closed, just as it had been all those years ago. But the cost would be the same. As the chamber collapsed inward, the walls began to bleed light and sound. Screams, songs, laughter, all overlapping, all desperate. The entity, no longer confined to Helena's form, rose tall above them, its voice a distorted choir of thousands. It was everywhere, in their heads, in the stone, in the air itself. But Lucia, with the blueprints in hand and the last of her strength, began to pray. Not in Latin, not in tongues, but in her own words. Honest, terrified, human. She didn't ask for deliverance. She asked to remember. She begged the silence to hold. And as her voice echoed across the chamber, the floor beneath the entity cracked wide open, not revealing hell, but something worse, oblivion. And slowly, piece by piece, the voice began to fall back into the dark. The silence returned slowly, cautiously, as if uncertain whether it had truly been earned. The chamber's breath, that awful rhythm that had controlled everything, faded into stillness. Lucia collapsed beside Father Miguel, her chest heaving, eyes burning with exhaustion and fear. All that remained of the entity was a residue in the air, a heaviness that clung to the skin like smoke after fire. The walls stood still. The stones stopped weeping. For a moment, they believed it was over, that the voice had finally returned to wherever it had come from. But then, Lucia noticed something that froze her blood. The veil. It was still on the floor, untouched by the chaos, untouched by time, folded just as it had been before the figure rose. She reached toward it, slowly, cautiously, and before her fingers touched it, she heard it, a single, final note. Faint, fragile, from deep below. Lucia snatched her hand back. The note was not sung, it was breathed, as if exhaled from the lungs of something buried beneath centuries of stone and secrets. She looked at Father Miguel, who nodded slowly. We didn't kill it, he said. We reminded it to sleep. And that was all they had done. Bought time. Nothing more. Together, they gathered the blueprints, careful not to let them touch the veil, and began the painful climb back through the ruins of the crumbled wall. The passage was narrower now, as if the earth itself had begun to seal it once more. Each step felt like wading through memory, the walls whispering faint echoes of songs no longer sung, of names forgotten, of sisters who had once believed they were safe. When they emerged into the chapel above, the candles were still burning. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The stained glass windows shimmered, as if freshly cleaned. The air was lighter, yes, but it was also aware. The chapel now held a secret too large for stone. And as Lucia turned to look back at the wall that had nearly taken her, she realized some voices don't haunt. They wait. The following days of the convent were quiet, but not peaceful. The sisters moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding the eastern wing entirely. No one asked about the veil. No one spoke of the voice. Even Mother Superior, once firm in her disbelief, kept her rosary tightly in hand and began attending every service without fail. A weight had settled over the place, not of evil, but of memory. Lucia couldn't forget what she had seen, not just the face beneath the veil, or the shadows, or the singing, but the realization that Sister Helena had not been lost, she had been chosen. And that what happened wasn't possession or madness. It was a calling, the kind that doesn't ask, the kind that comes for those already listening. And she feared that part of her still was. Father Miguel stayed in the chapel, sleeping on the pews, fasting for days, praying in silence. He would not speak to anyone but Lucia, and when he did, he spoke only of one thing: containment. The wall must remain, he repeated. But more importantly, the story must remain, because forgetting it is what wakes it. He had come not to banish darkness, but to remember its name. On the 12th night, Lucia had another dream. She was standing in the crypt again, though the chamber was whole. The stone was unbroken. The voice was gone. And in her hands, the rosary. Not black, not reversed, but white, unmarked, pure. She looked down and realized it wasn't Helena's veil folded at her feet. It was hers. She awoke drenched in sweat. The chapel bell rang once, softly, without cause, and outside her window, carved into the frost on the glass, were 4 words she hadn't written. It listens in silence. She turned to the wall, and in the space where the habit had first been found, a faint melody played. No source, no singer, just a tune, circling quietly, as if waiting for its next verse. Lucia began to keep her own journal, not of facts, but of feelings. She wrote about the stillness in the convent, the way the eastern corridor now seemed colder than the rest of the building, even on warm days. She described the pressure in her chest whenever she passed the chapel at night, and the sense that someone was watching, even though the pews were always empty. But what disturbed her most was that she missed the sound. Each night, she found herself waiting. Not hoping, not wanting, but waiting. As if part of her had been attuned to the frequency of that forgotten hymn. As if silence now felt too silent. It was a hunger without teeth. A melody with no words. And it lived just beneath her skin, vibrating in her bones. She tried to ignore it, to pray through it, but the silence would always answer first. Not with sound, but with invitation. She returned to the archive one last time. Alone. She pulled the oldest books from the shelves, the ones no one touched, the ones written by hand before the convent had electricity, before it had glass in its windows. In a leather-bound volume, she found a page written by a sister long before Helena's time. The entry was short. The song returned to my sleep. I did not sing, and it left me. But it wept. Those last 2 words unnerved her. It wept. Could a force like that mourn? Could something that consumed voices also grieve their absence? The idea was haunting. It implied awareness, emotion, perhaps even loneliness. And with that thought came a wave of guilt so strong it nearly knocked her to her knees. What if the voice didn't seek destruction, but companionship? What if every verse added was a way to remember, not erase? That night, as she sat in the chapel alone, she hummed. Not the full melody, just a fragment she remembered from the chamber. A handful of notes. A question, not an answer. And in the stillness that followed, the flame of the central candle bowed, slightly, as if to listen. No voice answered. No veil moved. But for the first time since sealing the crypt, Lucia didn't feel afraid. She felt heard. But the next morning, something changed. The wall where the habit had first been found, now fully resealed, bore a single, fine crack, no wider than a strand of hair. Lucia ran her fingers along it, heart racing. It hadn't been there the night before. The bricks were solid, the mortar dry, and yet there was a fracture, as if the wall had breathed in and forgotten how to exhale. She told Father Miguel, who stared at it in silence before turning away. "It remembers you," he said quietly. "You sang. Even a whisper is a key." He walked away without another word. Lucia didn't follow. Instead, she stood in the empty hallway, her hand pressed against the stone. The crack was cold, colder than anything else in the convent, and beneath it, she could almost feel a pulse. The other sisters began noticing it too. Dreams returned. Some of them began humming in their sleep, the same melody. When questioned, none remembered doing it. One of the youngest novices, Sister Clara, claimed she saw Sister Helena outside her room at dawn, her veil covering her face, standing perfectly still. But when Lucia checked the hallway, there were no footprints, only a faint scent of lilies and ash. Lucia's journal entries grew more erratic. Her handwriting slanted, her words repeated, and in the margins, strange symbols began to appear, one she didn't remember writing. She stopped praying out loud. The silence, once threatening, had become intimate, close, protective. And as the days passed, she began to wonder, had the voice truly been sealed, or had it simply moved? And one morning, before sunrise, she awoke to find a rosary on her pillow. Not hers, not Father Miguel's, but the black one from the chamber. Whole, warm, vibrating with a faint hum. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stared at it, because deep down she already knew. The wall hadn't cracked. She had. Father Miguel watched Lucia from a distance. He saw the way she paused before entering the chapel, how her head tilted slightly, listening for something no one else could hear. He noticed the way her fingers brushed against the walls, as if reacquainting herself with an old memory. And more than anything, he recognized the look in her eyes. Not fear, not confusion, resignation. He confronted her one morning, asking directly what she was hiding. Lucia said nothing at first. Then, with quiet honesty, she placed the black rosary on the table between them. "I didn't bring it," she said. "It came to me." Father Miguel recoiled, muttering a prayer under his breath. But Lucia wasn't shaken. Her voice was calm, steady, almost distant. "It's not a curse," she continued. "It's a call." The priest begged her to let him destroy it, to take it to the river and cast it into holy water. But when he reached for the beads, his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. His vision blurred. He dropped it, gasping for breath. It doesn't want me, he said through clenched teeth. It chose you. Lucia nodded, not proudly, but as if confirming something she had long suspected. That night, the chapel bells rang 13 times, though the tower only held 8. No one was seen near the ropes. No wind, no movement, just the sound, slow, deliberate, mournful. The sisters huddled together in prayer, but Lucia didn't join them. She sat alone in her room, tracing the symbols in her journal, her candle flickering beside her, the rosary glowing faintly in its shadow. At midnight, she stood and walked barefoot to the eastern corridor. She placed her hand on the wall, over the crack, and whispered one word. Open. Nothing happened immediately, but deep below, she felt it. A shift, a breath, not of something waking, but of something remembering. And in that moment, Lucia realized, the voice never sleeps. It only waits for the right singer to return. By dawn, the crack in the wall had widened, barely enough to notice, unless you were looking. But Lucia noticed, and she wasn't afraid. She was calm, methodical. She didn't speak to the other sisters. She didn't write in her journal. She simply began to prepare, not for a battle, but for a ritual, as though she'd accepted that her path was no longer beside the others, but beneath them. In the chapel, she found Sister Agnes lighting the morning candles. The elderly nun turned and looked at her, eyes wide. Your eyes, she whispered. They look like hers. Lucia smiled gently, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, No, they look like mine now. There was no aggression, no madness, only clarity, the kind of peace that precedes surrender. That evening, Father Miguel found the chapel doors locked from the inside. The bells had begun to ring again, low, slow, with a tone that seemed to bend the air around them. He forced the door open and found Lucia standing at the altar, the black rosary looped 3 times around her wrist. She was humming, a single note, over and over. With every repetition, the stones in the chapel floor trembled faintly. He tried to speak, but the sound died in his throat. Her gaze met his, not hostile, not distant, but full of memory, full of voices, full of something ancient and listening. I'm not alone, she said. I never was. None of us ever are. And with that, she raised her hand, and the wall behind the altar began to move. Stone groaned as it parted, dust pouring into the air, revealing a passage no blueprint had ever recorded, a passage that had not been opened in decades, perhaps centuries. And from within that corridor, a breeze. Not warm, not cold, but alive, carrying with it a sound not heard, but felt. And as Lucia stepped into the darkness, the voice welcomed her home. Lucia walked slowly into the newly opened corridor, the sound of her bare feet against the stone drowned by the rising hum around her. It wasn't music, not yet, but the breath before it, the promise of song. The passage descended, winding deeper beneath the convent than anyone knew existed. With each step, the air grew thicker, richer, as if soaked in memory. It was not fear that guided her, but recognition. Every curve of the wall felt familiar. Behind her, Father Miguel hesitated at the threshold. He could not bring himself to follow, not because he was afraid of death, but because he feared what would be asked of him if he survived. He fell to his knees in the chapel, clutching his crucifix, whispering desperate prayers to a God he now feared was no longer the only one listening. The rosary on his wrist, his own, burned cold against his skin. Deeper still, Lucia came upon a chamber, smaller than the last, but more ornate. The walls were covered in carvings, not written by hand, but grown into the stone, as though the music had etched itself into the bones of the earth. In the center stood a pedestal. Upon it, a single object, a book, bound in black leather, sealed by a lock shaped like a mouth. Closed, waiting. Lucia stepped closer. The hum in the air now pulsed with rhythm, like a heart beating through the walls. Her hand hovered above the book, and the lock clicked open on its own. Inside, the pages were blank at first, until she touched one. Then, line by line, symbols began to etch themselves across the surface. Not ink, but shadow. Language she didn't understand, yet instantly knew. The first page bore a name, Helena. The second, Agnes. The third, Lucia. Her hand trembled as the fourth page began to write itself. Slowly, carefully, a new name, one she hadn't heard yet, one that didn't belong to her yet, a name she would soon give voice to. Because the song did not end with silence. It ended when the next voice forgot it used to be human. Outside, the convent was changing. The bells rang without rhythm now, as though mimicking a melody only they could hear. The sky above darkened, not with clouds, but with stillness, a heavy dusk that settled long before the sun was meant to fall. The sisters spoke little, gathering in corners, unsure what they felt, but unable to pretend it wasn't happening. Time itself seemed to stretch between their prayers. Sister Clara, the youngest, wandered into the chapel that night and found Father Miguel still kneeling. His body was still, his lips moving slowly, endlessly. She called to him, but he didn't respond. When she stepped closer, she realized he wasn't speaking. He was repeating a phrase, over and over. She is beneath. She is the voice. She is beneath. She is the voice. In the eastern wing, the walls began to sweat. Beads of dark moisture formed along the baseboards, and the floor creaked in long, slow waves, like something alive was shifting beneath it. Whispers returned to the halls. Familiar ones. Voices of the sisters, but from years ago. Echoes of conversations never recorded, now repeating like memories unwilling to fade. Back in the chamber, Lucia continued turning pages. Each name she saw triggered a fragment of melody in her mind. A note, a voice, a face. She was no longer reading history. She was hearing it, living it. The names were not records, they were verses. Each person a stanza, each memory a chorus. And the book was the hymn book of the forgotten. When she reached the final page, there was no name, only a question carved in silence. Will you sing for them? Lucia didn't answer aloud. She didn't need to. She closed the book, turned toward the dark, and exhaled a single, perfect note. The stone pulsed. The air bowed, and far above, in the chapel, the candle flames danced in rhythm, to the beginning of a song no one had heard in 27 years. The note Lucia released didn't echo. It expanded. It stretched outward like light through stained glass, touching every stone, every relic, every soul still breathing above. The convent trembled in response, but not with violence, with alignment, like a key finally turning in the lock it had waited for over a generation. The voice had returned, not as a scream, nor a warning, but as a presence that demanded to be remembered. Sister Clara, alone in the corridor, froze as the air shifted. Her breath caught, her vision blurred, and then she heard it. A melody so soft it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. It came from beneath the floor, from a chapel, from the walls, and most terrifying of all, from within herself. She whispered the tune before realizing her lips had even moved, and in that moment, she understood. The song wasn't learned. It was inherited. Father Miguel awoke from his trance at the exact moment Lucia reached the final step in her descent. His eyes snapped open, wide and empty, as if seeing something far beyond the chapel ceiling. It's begun, he whispered. The seal was never meant to hold forever. He stumbled to his feet, clutching his chest, and collapsed before the altar. His final prayer was not for salvation, but for silence. Below, Lucia stood before a second chamber. This one wider, lower, not built, but grown, like a cavern of worship etched by centuries of breath. In the center, a stone platform pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Upon it, the veil. Not Helena's, not Agnes. Hers. Folded, prepared, placed with care. And, surrounding it, 7 candles. Each already lit. Each flame swaying in time with the music only she could hear. She stepped forward and knelt, not out of duty, but out of belonging. She took the veil in her hands and placed it over her head. And the moment the fabric touched her skin, the chamber sighed. A collective exhale from the stones, the air, the song itself. And in that stillness, the voice returned, not to haunt, not to claim, but to continue. Because the song had never ended. It had only waited for her. Outside, the world remained unaware. The sky lightened with the approach of dawn, birds began to stir, and life moved forward as if nothing had changed. But within the walls of the convent, everything was different. The sisters awoke to a calm so deep it felt unnatural. The bells did not ring. The candles did not flicker. And the corridor leading to the eastern wing had vanished. Where there had once been a wall with a crack, there was now smooth stone, seamless and bare. No passage, no trace, as if it had never existed. Only the faintest scent of burning incense lingered in the air. Sister Clara stood before it, hand trembling, whispering the tune she no longer remembered learning. Behind her, the other sisters gathered, silent, listening, understanding. In the chapel, Father Miguel's body was found at the foot of the altar, peaceful, hands folded, eyes closed. Around him, the candles had all extinguished, save for one. The flame burned brighter than ever before, unwavering in its silence. Sister Agnes wept beside him, not out of sorrow, but out of reverence. She too heard the faint hum beneath the floor, a harmony older than language. Lucia was never seen again. Her name was never spoken aloud. Her room was left untouched, her journal sealed and stored in the deepest part of the archives. But sometimes, late at night, the sisters would gather in the chapel and hear her, not with ears, but with memory. A voice not singing to be heard, but to be carried. A note suspended in sacred air, reminding them of what was, what is, and what always waits beneath. And so, the habit remains folded. The rosary rests. The veil is worn. And the voice that began with Helena, that passed through Lucia, now hums in silence. Not as a warning, not as a curse, but as remembrance. Because some songs are not sung to be performed. They are sung to make sure the silence never forgets. Years passed, and the convent became quieter with each season. New sisters joined, unaware of the story buried in stone. The eastern wing was spoken of only in hushed tones, often with pauses long enough for a whisper to slip through. No one dared remodel it. No one dared break the walls again. It wasn't fear that kept them away. It was reverence, the silent kind that feels more sacred than words. But something lingered. The song, though no longer heard in full, found its way into prayers. Melodies hummed unconsciously during chores. Candles that flickered in rhythm. Rosaries that felt warm in the palm. The voice wasn't gone. It had simply woven itself into their lives, not to haunt, but to remind. That devotion, when true, leaves echoes. And those echoes never fade. One day, a visiting historian arrived, drawn by the convent's age and quiet legend. He was polite, curious, respectful, but persistent. He asked about Helena, about Lucia, about the wall. The sisters gave him little, not out of secrecy, but because they understood, you don't explain a sacred wound to someone who only wants to write it down. He left with pages of dates, but no story. The real history refused to be archived. But Clara, now grown, now a teacher within those same walls, walked past the old chapel that evening and paused. For a moment, she thought she saw someone kneeling at the altar. A figure in a dark habit, head bowed, veil heavy. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. And just before the figure dissolved into shadow, it lifted its head and met her gaze. The eyes were calm, familiar, and smiling. She said nothing of it to the others. But that night, she placed a single candle on the eastern wall, not out of fear, not out of duty, but as a gesture, a message, that the voice had not been forgotten. And somewhere deep below, where stone remembers sound, a single note hummed in reply. Winter came with a strange gentleness that year. Snow blanketed the convent grounds, muffling the world into soft silence. The sisters moved like echoes through the halls, their daily rituals now layered with an unspoken reverence. And every evening, Clara would pause by the eastern corridor, tracing the smooth wall where the crack once lived. She no longer expected answers, only presence. One morning, as she was lighting candles, she found something peculiar near the altar, a white feather. Not from bird, not from any sister's garment. Perfectly clean, warm to the touch. She picked it up and, without knowing why, placed it inside her prayer book. That night, she dreamed of a staircase carved in music, of a habit folded on stone, of a song without words that ended with her own name. More dreams followed. Not nightmares, not exactly, but heavy, meaningful. She saw Lucia, Helena, even Father Miguel. They stood in silence, hands at their sides, not speaking, only listening. To her. Each time she woke, she found herself humming. The same note, a tone she never remembered learning, but always knew how to finish. It lived in her bones now, like breath, like faith. And then, without announcement, a new novice arrived. Young, quiet, with eyes that never flinched in shadow. On her second night, Clara found her standing alone in the chapel, humming. The note was perfect, pure, as though she had carried it across lifetimes. Clara watched from the doorway, heart full of something between joy and sorrow. The song had found its next verse. So the veil continues. The song lives on, passed not through instruction, but through recognition. Not every sister sings. Not every heart listens. But for those who do, those who remember what the silence once sounded like, the voice is never truly gone. It waits behind walls, beneath stone, within prayer. And when the time is right, it will rise again. The young novice's name was Elena. She had come from a quiet village many kilometers away, saying little about her past, but carrying a serenity that made others fall silent in her presence. She asked no questions about the convent's history, yet her eyes seemed to search the corridors like someone who had already been there before. And more than once, the older sisters caught her humming in her sleep, always the same low, reverent note. Clara began to spend more time with Elena. Not to teach, but to observe. She noticed the girl's affinity for quiet places. How she lingered near the chapel's eastern wall longer than anyone else. How her prayers were short, but deeply still. It was not knowledge that Elena sought. It was connection. And without understanding why, Clara began to feel as if the voice had chosen again, as it once had with Helena and Lucia. One evening, as snow fell in soft spirals outside the stained glass, Clara found Elena seated on the floor of the library, surrounded by hymnals. Not reading them, listening to them. Her fingers moved lightly over the pages, like she was waiting for one of them to respond. Clara didn't interrupt. She simply sat beside her. After a long silence, Elena whispered, "They remember more than we do." Later that night, a tremor passed through the eastern wing. Subtle, barely enough to rattle a frame. But every sister felt it. Some dismissed it as the old bones of the building settling in the cold. Others, however, paused, eyes closing, as if they had heard something awaken. Not a threat, not a ghost, but a recognition, a shift, a breath returning to lungs that had waited too long to exhale. In her room, Elena began to write. Not essays, not prayers, symbols, lines, marks, curves that held no obvious meaning, until seen from a distance or heard in silence. They formed patterns, rhythms, and in her dreams, the song became more than sound. It became structure, and the veil, though unworn, already waited for her in the vision's quiet light. Days later, a visitor arrived at the convent's gate. An elderly man with a satchel of yellowed papers and eyes that shimmered with time. He claimed to be a former student of Father Miguel. He brought no demands, only questions. About the chapel, about a nun who vanished in the winter of 1985, about the habit found behind the wall. His voice was gentle, but his presence stirred the air like a forgotten note striking a familiar chord. Clara met him in the garden. He shared what little he had. Notes from Miguel's early letters, half-burned records from diocesan archives, and a sketch of the eastern corridor before it had sealed itself. As he unfolded the drawing, a gust of wind passed through the trees, scattering the pages. Elena appeared from nowhere, retrieving a sheet and handing it back with eyes full of calm knowledge. The man stared at her. "She has it," he said quietly. That night, the chapel filled with a silence so complete it felt like sound inverted. No bells, no footsteps, only presence. Elena entered barefoot, wearing a simple white gown, and stood before the altar. In her hands, the same black rosary, once carried by Lucia. How she came to possess it, no one knew. But no one questioned it. Clara remained in the doorway, not interfering, only bearing witness. Elena sang one note, then another, then three more, stitched together in a melody that had no composer, only inheritance. The candles lit themselves in rhythm. The walls breathed in and out with every verse. And then, just as the final note faded, a faint glow emerged from behind the altar. The wall pulsed, not opening, not yet, but responding. The elderly man, still seated in the garden, smiled with tears in his eyes. "They're listening again," he whispered. "After all these years, the voice is still alive." And in that quiet hour, while the world turned unaware outside the stone walls, the convent stood like a great vessel of memory, humming gently with the music of those who were never meant to be forgotten. The following morning, the chapel held a different kind of stillness, not silence, but suspension, as if the very air had paused mid-prayer. The sisters moved through the convent with a shared sense of waiting, though none could name what they were waiting for. Elena remained quiet, but the corners of her eyes carried a knowing. Something had shifted. Something had been heard. In the refectory, the sisters found a piece of parchment placed at the center of the table, not written by hand, but pressed, as if formed by pressure and time. Upon it, a pattern of symbols, similar to those Elena had drawn. Beneath them, a line in Latin, "Quae canavit mene," she who sang, remains. Sister Clara felt a chill not of fear, but of awe, as if the convent itself had spoken. That evening, Clara descended alone into the chapel, compelled by something beyond curiosity. The altar was undisturbed. The rosary still rested in its place, but the air was warm, soft, like breath pressed against her cheek. She knelt, closed her eyes, and let her mind fall into the soundless melody that lived beneath the surface of things. For the first time, she didn't try to remember the song. She let the song remember her. In the days that followed, Elena grew more radiant, her steps lighter, her voice softer. The younger novices began to seek her silently, drawn by something they couldn't name. Not charisma, not authority, but resonance. She didn't lead them. She simply carried something, and what she carried called others closer. One by one, they began to hum, not in imitation, in recognition. And on the seventh night, just before dawn, the eastern wall breathed once more. This time, it didn't tremble or whisper. It opened, slowly, silently, revealing not a corridor, but a space beyond time. A sanctuary lit by unseen flame. The scent of myrrh and old stone hung in the air. And from deep within, a sound, not a cry, not a warning, but a note. Sustained, patient, inviting. Elena stepped through first. No hesitation, no fear. Her veil trailed behind her like a stream of shadow and light. The sisters followed, not because they were told to, but because they belonged to that moment. The sanctuary beyond the wall welcomed them not as guests, but as continuations. A place where breath became memory, where song became presence. The chamber was circular, carved not by hands, but by intention. Along its curved walls were alcoves, each holding a candle, a relic, or a single word etched in stone. Names, dozens, hundreds, each one humming faintly. And above, suspended without chains, a massive bell, cracked through the center, yet singing with every flicker of breath. It rang not with sound, but with knowing. Clara moved slowly, her heart racing in quiet rhythm. She touched a relic, a small cross, charred and weathered, and a rush of warmth flooded her chest. Images not her own surged behind her eyes. Helena's prayer in the snow, Lucia's hand trembling over a page, Father Miguel's whisper beneath candlelight. The line had not broken. It had waited. For them. For her. Elena approached the center of the room, where a basin of clear water reflected not her face, but the chapel above. She reached in, fingers skimming the surface, and began to sing, not words but truth. Each note echoed against the chamber in perfect response. The bell above pulsed gently, resonating like a heartbeat in stone. The walls did not hold the sound. They became it. And as the final tone hung in the air, every candle flared once. The sanctuary grew brighter, not with fire, but with memory made visible. The sisters knelt, hands joined, and for the first time in decades, the convent wasn't holding a secret. It was holding a choir, not of voices, but of souls, each singing the part they were always meant to carry. As the sisters emerged from the sanctuary, they carried no objects, no relics, only a silence that spoke louder than words. That night, none of them slept. The convent, though unchanged in form, felt entirely reborn. Its walls no maze echoed with hidden grief, but pulsed with remembrance. And in every corridor, there was an invisible presence, not watching, but accompanying. Elena stood beneath the old bell tower, eyes fixed on the moon above. The wind carried the scent of myrrh and iron, and for a moment, she felt something press lightly on her shoulder. When she turned, no one was there, but she heard it, faintly, as if carried across time. "Well done, child." The words were not praise, but release, a permission to carry the voice forward without fear. Clara, now older and worn with wisdom, sat alone in the library that night. She pulled from the archives the only remaining letter written by Helena, aged, crumbling, forgotten. It spoke not of fear or finality, but of passing something forward. A voice, yes, but also a burden. And in the final line, smudged and almost unreadable, was a name. Not Helena's, not Lucia's, Clara's. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply lit a candle, placed the letter beside it, and whispered the name aloud. Her own, not out of pride, but out of surrender. She finally understood. The song never chose the strongest, the loudest, or the most faithful. It chose the ones willing to listen through silence, the ones who could disappear without vanishing. Outside, snow began to fall once more, the same kind of snowfall that had covered the steps when Helena vanished. But this time, no one would disappear. No one would be forgotten, because what had been buried behind walls and beneath fear had finally found its voice again, and the voice no longer needed to hide. The bell rang the next morning, not with ropes, not with hands, but with purpose. Its chime echoed through the valley, startling birds into flight and pausing travelers on distant roads. The village below looked upward, confused. The bell hadn't sounded in over 2 decades, yet it rang with such clarity that even those who had never stepped inside the convent felt something shift inside them. A journalist from the city arrived within days, drawn by reports of the mysterious bell. He asked questions, took photographs, interviewed the local parishioners. But when he reached the convent gates, Elena met him with a gentle smile and a single word: closed. Not in defiance, but in protection. Some stories are not headlines. Some truths are not meant to be filtered through ink and pixels. That night, Elena returned to the sanctuary alone. The bell above had stopped ringing, but in her heart, the music continued, fuller now, complete. As she lit each candle in the circular chamber, she whispered the names carved into the walls, one by one, with reverence, with continuity, until she reached the final name, one she hadn't carved, one she didn't recognize. And yet, somehow, it was hers. She didn't question it. She only placed her hand over the name and felt the stone pulse, warm, alive. The chamber responded with a faint hum, as if approving her presence, as if acknowledging that she was now part of the choir, no longer just an echo, no longer just a carrier. She had become a note within the song itself. Above ground, in the chapel, the sisters gathered for evening prayer, and as they began to chant, no one led, no one followed. The melody flowed through them as one, layered, ancient, unbroken. And in the stillness between verses, if one listened closely enough, there was a voice, not new, not old, but eternal, and finally, fully home. In the days that followed, the convent grew quieter, not from absence, but from fulfillment. The sisters spoke less, smiled more, and moved through the halls as if they were pages in a sacred book still being written. The story of Helena, of Lucia, of the hidden sanctuary, was no longer a secret. It was a song now carried in every footstep, in every whisper of wind across the cloistered gardens. Clara, once the curious novice, now the silent matriarch, spent more time alone, watching the younger sisters bloom under Elena's quiet guidance. She saw in them not copies, but continuations, each one a thread in the tapestry the voice had begun weaving so many years ago, before walls, before habits, before even prayer had found its words. She no longer wondered why it had chosen her. She only listened. One evening, as dusk fell like a silk veil across the chapel, Elena approached Clara with something wrapped in cloth. Inside it, the original habit, Helena's. Preserved. Whole. Still holding the faint scent of myrrh and snowfall. Elena did not ask. She only waited. Clara smiled, placed her hand on the fabric, and nodded once. It belongs with the voice now, she whispered. They walked together to the sanctuary, entering in silence. At the center, beneath the suspended bell, they laid the habit across the basin of still water. It did not sink. It floated, shimmering, and slowly faded into light. Not flame, not evaporation, but memory ascending. The bell chimed once, without touch, and from the stone around them came a sound so low, so ancient, it could only be felt by the soul. And then, silence again. Not absence, but presence. A completion. A sacred punctuation at the end of a verse that had waited 27 years to be heard. Clara took Elena's hand, and together they returned to the surface, not as sisters bound by routine, but as keepers of a story too alive to be buried, and too holy to be owned. On the final night of winter, as the last frost clung to the monastery walls, a single candle was left burning in the chapel, not for ritual, but as witness. Outside, the world continued. Traffic passed, seasons turned, lives went on. But within those stone walls, time had folded into itself, creating a space where eternity could whisper softly through the cracks. Elena, now fully veiled, stood at the window of her cell, watching the candle flicker from afar. She no longer needed to hear the voice, because now she was the voice, not in volume, not in authority, but in presence. Every breath she took was an echo of those who had come before. Every silence she honored was a verse passed down in stillness, and she understood that the voice had never belonged to anyone. It had always belonged to all who listened. Below, a new novice swept the floor with gentle hands. She paused near the eastern corridor, drawn by a subtle warmth beneath the stone. She hummed, not because she was taught to, but because it felt right. And the moment she did, a candle flickered on its own. A breath of air passed through her hair. She smiled, not knowing why, but feeling seen. In the library, Clara wrote one last entry in a worn journal. No names, no dates, just a single line. She was never lost, only waiting to be remembered. She closed the book, placed it beneath the oldest hymnal, and walked away. The sound of her footsteps was joined by another, soft, steady, familiar, though no one else was in the room. And far beneath the chapel, in a chamber carved by faith and song, the bell remained. Cracked, yes, but alive. And should the world forget again, should silence return, it would wait. Patient, listening, until one heart, one voice, one note rose again and remembered what had always been singing beneath the stone. In the end, this was never just a story about a nun who vanished. It was about what remains when a voice disappears, and how silence, when listened to with reverence, can speak louder than words. It was about the echoes we carry, the memories we inherit, and the sacred responsibility of remembering those who were once forgotten. Helena did not vanish into darkness. She passed into continuity, into a song that simply changed who was singing. The habit behind the wall wasn't just cloth, it was testimony. Proof that time does not bury what the soul protects, that walls cannot silence what faith preserves, and that even when truth is hidden, it pulses quietly, waiting for the moment when someone brave enough, or quiet enough, will listen again. The sisters didn't find Helena. They became her legacy, and in doing so, gave voice to all who had been left voiceless. There's a part of this story that belongs to each of us, not because we have worn veils or walk cold corridors, but because we all carry forgotten rooms inside us, memories sealed behind walls of fear, silence, or time. And maybe, just maybe, there's a voice in each of us still waiting to be heard, a note that was never lost, only waiting for the right moment to be sung again. So if this story touched you, not just as a mystery, but as something true, something that resonates beyond words, then let it linger. Let it echo inside your thoughts long after the video ends. And more than anything, remember, some voices do not fade. They wait. And when we choose to listen, we don't just remember the past. We awaken the present. If this journey moves something inside you, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with what part resonated most with your heart, and share this video with someone who may need to hear the voice behind the silence. Sometimes, the act of listening is the most powerful thing we can do. And today, you listened. Thank you.